not all art necessarily makes an appeal to the visual senses, but let's say that most of it does. So it's might seem unnecessary or unnecessarily elementary to say so, but sometimes it's worth reminding ourselves that art is something meant to be seen primarily, that the appeal that art makes to our intellect and emotions, our attention, is achieved through visual stimuli, and that's a different animal than other things, than writing or music. The eye is capable of incredibly subtle perceptual distinctions that happen on an unconscious level. So the act of looking consciously is really partly a matter of paying attention to what it is that we notice when we really look at something. Because another way of putting it is to think about drawing. If you've ever taken a drawing class, or you've ever even read a book about how drawing is taught, the first, most elementary lesson is usually a demonstration of the difference between what you see in front of you and what you think you see. Invariably, the first attempts at drawing something from life, from perception, invariably involve distorting what's actually in front of you, because the brain intercedes with the eye and gives false information. For example, we know that the head has two eyes and a nose and a mouth, so we will draw it that way, even if in fact we don't see both eyes equally, or we don't see, depending on our point of view, we'll see a partial representation of what the brain thinks of as reality. So this is a long way around of saying that the way to approach the visual world is to take in the information and let it work on your cortex without, well, it's impossible to say without, but while trying to stay neutral in terms of what we think we know. Because part of the confusion surrounding contemporary art is that we know it's laden with meaning, and we go to it intent on ferreting out the meaning, which sometimes happens in advance of doing the actual looking. When I say that ideally one should approach art with a visually neutral kind of screen, that visual neutrality is of course a kind of cultural impossibility. None of us are neutral, nor could we ever be, and probably nor should we be. When I say one should approach art with a neutral eye, what I mean is to try to log in your brain, to log what's there physically in terms of what was made in advance of reaching for what the thing might or might not mean. So that if you're looking at a portrait, let's say, what is a portrait? A portrait is a painting of a face. Of course, the face is the subject, but the way the face is painted, the way the portrait is presented to us in its specificity, is more important as art than who it's a portrait of. It's probably not possible to view art without the filter of 17 different kinds of cultural filters, I don't think that would be, probably that would require the equanimity of a Buddha. However, what I'm suggesting and what I'm advocating in the book is simply to devote some of one's attention to the physical fact of what is in front of us, the physical fact of what was made, how it was made, what materials were used, the how was it done kind of question, as opposed to what it's a representation of. This kind of attention is what used to be called formalism, which I think is a little bit of a misnomer. It has been, I think, unfairly or unusefully demonized as something either culturally aloof or simply not interesting. But the first principles of in any field, of any art form, music, architecture, literature, the first principles being how is it constructed, what is it constructed of. Those are the kinds of perceptual questions which anyone can ask themselves and be aware of without any cultural training. The impulse to make art is a mysterious one. It still remains mysterious after many millennia. What is that impulse that compels someone to make an image of something on a two-dimensional surface or a three-dimensional form, for that matter? I often think that the way to approach art is to imagine doing it for oneself. Imagine what are the steps involved to make that thing that you're looking at. What would you have to do if you were going to make that, whatever that is? Even things as banal as getting on the subway to go to the art supply store. What do you have to buy? What are the materials you have to buy? What kind of space do you need to be able to make that thing in? In other words, one way to think about art is to just imagine yourself as the artist, imagine yourself as the maker. Put yourself in the artist's shoes, so to speak, and imagine the steps that one would have to go through, very much like when you read a cookbook and there's an illustrated step-by-step recipe that you follow. First you have to put these ingredients in, then you have to preheat the oven. Sometimes imagining the banal task-like steps involved in making something helps us to appreciate what it is that was made, instead of looking at the result in a completely meaning-laden kind of way. And we don't really, I'm not to strain it to the breaking point, but if the cooking analogy has any use at all, we don't ask of a pie, what does it mean? We just ask, does it taste good? And then if you're interested in how it stacks up next to other pies, and then you might ask yourself, well, what was the recipe and what were the ingredients and what's different about those from some other ingredients? All of this is another way of saying that art is something that someone made, and the human aspect of the making part of it is, I think, the place where one can reliably go to both find a connection to the art and also to get closer to whatever the artist's emotional field might be.